From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
So good morning and good afternoon. This is always the time where it's both. I'm Jennifer Harpster. I'm a reference and research specialist here at the Library of Congress with the Science, Technology, and Business Division. I'd like to welcome you guys to today's program, Discovering the Northwest Passage, the 4-year Arctic Odyssey of the HMS Investigator and the McClure Expedition. As I said before, we have a lot in store for you today. Author Glenn Stein will be talking about his recent book, which I'd like to note has been placed in the Royal Library of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II at Windsor Castle. We also have a special presentation by Parks Canada senior underwater archaeologist Ryan Harris, who dove on the wreck of the HMS Investigator. We have extended the time today for this program to allow these two speakers. Also a question and answer period, which will be after each speaker. Glenn will start first, and then we'll have a question and answer period that we need to limit to about maybe 10 minutes or so. And then Ryan will speak, and then we'll have a question and answer period after that. And then following all of that, we're gonna have a book signing. So to keep us on track, I really need to keep this introduction short. But I want to let you know about our speakers a little bit. So it is definitely my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Glenn Marty Stein, who has been researching and writing about maritime and polar history since 1975. He is a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. He's a life member of the American Polar Society, a member of the Orders and Medals Research Society, and Life Saving Awards Research Society. So in 2006, Stein began to do in-depth research for this book, and he published a 2-part article, The Voyage of HMS Investigator, 1850 to 54, which was awarded the Orders and Medals Research Society Journal Prize in 2008-9. This is not Glenn's first visit to the Library of Congress. In February of 2013, Glenn was a co-presenter for a program called By Endurance We Conquer, Shackleton and Lessons of Leadership from the Imperial Trans-Arctic Centenary Expedition. Glenn is also a formal editorial cartoonist for the newspaper La Prensa, and the library recently acquired some of his drawings to add to our amazing cartoon and caricature collection. So anchors away, and join me in welcoming back author and historian Glenn Stein to the Library of Congress.
Well, thank you very much, Jennifer. I appreciate that introduction. And also, too, I want to make a little announcement here about the room we're in, because it somewhat has a connection to what I'm going to talk about. We, of course, are in the Mumford Room, and one of the investigators on the expedition was named James Nelson. And in the Arctic, he became quite friendly with a gentleman named William Mumford, who was on one of the rescue ships called HMS Resolute. So they actually stayed friends after they came home from the Arctic. So there's a little bit of serendipity there. But thank you to the Library of Congress and to everyone involved with this production today. I appreciate the welcome very much. And of course to Ryan Harris for so graciously coming down and presenting with me today. And I also want to mention the tremendous support I received for many years now in researching and producing the book from my editor, Layla Milholland, and everyone at McFarland Books. I also want to thank you for being here today, and also my wife, Marcia, for her kind support all throughout these years, and also mention that our twin daughters, Aaliyah and Rebecca, would be here today, except their college studies trumped even Dad's book launch. That's okay. That's okay. I can appreciate that, and I respect them for that. There's also a couple anniversaries of sorts that I'd like to mention. I have a slight connection with exploration myself, In fact, 26 years ago this month, when I was working at Cape Kennedy, I used to work in security out there, I supported my first space mission, and it was the Galileo spacecraft that went to Jupiter. So at that time, they launched the spacecraft, and it took 6 years before it reached the planet. So there's a connection there between the length of time in the days of old exploration and space travel. There's also another anniversary of sorts today. It was 20 years ago this month when fellow polar historian A.G.E. Jones wrote to me. And to put things in perspective here, Jones and I had become very friendly and corresponded quite a bit. And he wrote to me once that he had seen Charles Lindbergh land in Croydon, England in 1927. So Jones had been at it a little bit longer than I had. And in the last line of the letter that he wrote to me on this occasion, he wrote, "Carry on wondering, as that is the way to get to the bottom of a story that everybody has taken for granted." I've always remembered that. 4 years after this time, I was at a convention in San Jose, California, and I had seen a woman named Diana Birch, who I had never personally met, but we had corresponded over the years, and I went up and introduced myself. Well, as my name left my lips, she shouted, "Oh, you're the polar man." And this is the kind of response I often receive from people, in part because I'm a native Floridian. So nobody ever puts that together. They never quite expect that when I tell them I research polar history. They look at me rather strangely, and I have to explain it. And then afterwards, I actually came across a man named John Tamplin, who was a metal collector and researcher himself, who I, again, had never met face to face, but we had corresponded quite a bit over the years. At this time, John was in his early 70s, and I was 36 years of age. And when I introduced myself, this huge grin swept across his face, and he took me by my shoulders and shook me and exclaimed how wonderful it was to meet me. And I found out later that John was shocked at my youth for someone who was interested in polar exploration and had the knowledge that I had acquired at that time. He just couldn't believe that I was that young. So this is the experience that I've had on occasion from people that I've run across over the now almost 41 years that I've been doing research. What I'm going to do to start off with is I'm going to read part of the preface from my book, Discovering the Northwest Passage. It gives you something of a overview of what I had hoped to achieve when I started the book, and of course what I did eventually, I hope, achieve. The story that follows is true. This is a balanced account of the human story behind the 4-year Arctic odyssey of the men of Her Majesty's Ship Investigator during their search for the missing Franklin expedition and the Northwest Passage. Through an unfiltered lens, I have gone to great lengths to understand and accurately depict the events and the people in which they were involved. On April 11th, 1970, I stood in amazement on a Florida beach gazing upon Apollo 13 as she hurtled toward the moon. 2 days later, hundreds of human and computerized minds melded in a race to save 3 explorers trapped within the frigid void of space. To the Victorian mind, the Arctic was the moon. Like outer space, the polar regions offer life and death, and the difference between them hangs by a thread. Exploration has always been as much about, if not more, the human species' struggle with itself as its struggle with the natural world. With the investigators, I focused on seeking out possibilities and then finding answers. In the following pages, an understanding emerges through the careful peeling away of layers of reality these men confronted during the expedition. As I immersed myself in the journals, documents, and letters of the investigators and other polar explorers of the period, their words washed over me. I delved into naval customs, ship construction, oceanography, ice navigation, and the effects of extreme cold and starvation on the human body. anything that allowed me to inch closer to their 19th century world. At the same time, I strived to understand the indigenous peoples with whom the sailors and Marines came into contact, and obtaining a sense of their culture, and in particular, their relationship with Europeans. What I'd like to do is give you an overview of how this book evolved and some of the highlights, some of the things that I actually was able to discover during my research. And very much focus on the word evolve, because the book did change as I wrote it and grew. And I was very, very pleased with the result in that regard, because I was able, I think, to bring out even a richer story than I had intended to or foresaw. And perhaps there's no better way to begin than the end. After the book was finished and it went to press, I remarked to my wife one night, if I never write another word again, it will have been worth it. And a word about writing, I think, is very appropriate here. I often tell people that the thing that really should be kept in mind is that I spend a lot more time thinking about what I'm going to write than actually writing. So that has really remained uppermost in the whole process. And this, along with the self-editing that I did through the whole process, meant that there was a tremendous time saving in the long run. Another example is I built my bibliography as I went along. So I had a quick reference myself, and I was able to actually make corrections in it at the end, because I'd already built a full bibliography instead of trying to create one at that time. From the beginning, I was very concerned about getting it right and preserving the memories of the investigators. That was extremely important to me. I've been in contact with a lot of descendants of the expedition, and I certainly did not want to write things that were not true about these people. And one of the things that I did was I wrote a letter to the historian David McCullough and expressed my concern. And he was very gracious in writing back that, in part, what a fine and engaging letter from you. Thank you very much for your good spirits and understanding of what's at stake in writing a book. Gives me a great lift. So from that, I thought, well, I'm probably on the right track here. I'm probably heading the right direction. So one of the things that really impressed me in going into this was, or made an impression on me, I should say, is how I needed to make the writing and the experience for the reader as authentic as possible. And in a way, what I wanted to do was use the investigators' words as much as possible. And I found a lot of unpublished material that was out there, and fortunately I was able to really go through and juxtapose all the published and unpublished material and hopefully come up with a really authentic idea of what occurred in many circumstances. These are typical sailors of the time period. Although there was nobody as young as the boy you see right here, let's see here, right there. That's a boy, small boy, who was not uncommon during Victorian days aboard ship. They could be as young as 9 or 10 years old. But these other sailors really represent very typical sailors of the period. Also, these are Royal Marines from the same time period. And again, very, very typical of who you would see, except for, again, whoops, sorry about that, the drummer boy right here, the drummer boy. Now, in order to do what I set out to do and really present an authentic narrative, I needed to create an infrastructure. And I knew this right from the very beginning. And by that, I assembled a whole host of folders in my computer, anything from the Franklin search expeditions all the way through to something like specialized medical information related to the polar regions. So I set everything up, and I was able to easily juxtapose all this information and move forward in my writing and explain things, hopefully in a very clear way to the reader. Also, too, I knew illustrations were going to be extremely important, so I began gathering as many illustrations as I could related to Arctic scenes, ships, to various people, anything I could which I felt was going to be important. And I figured that the best thing to do was to infuse these in the text relative to the subject matter at hand, so the reader would see the subject matter that I was writing about or was being written about and relate to it. Also, too, I wanted to bring people as close as I could to the investigators themselves, and this meant displaying and writing about particular artifacts, the very, very personal artifacts, like this one here. Okay, this is a Naval General Service Medal, which was given to Private First Class George Parfit. He was one of the 8 Royal Marines who was a board investigator, and the medal was given to him only in the months prior to leaving for the expedition. Now, the Marines in particular were required to wear these medals on formal occasions, and since the ship was going to be away for several years, every reason to believe that that medal was with Parfit through the entire voyage and went through the Northwest Passage. I also set about to create individual biographies of all 66 men on board. And in this regard, a lot of things came to the surface. One of the things that came to the surface is that over 39 men out of the 66 who were on board actually had served together in the 9 years prior to the expedition. This meant that there was a certain unity among the crew before the expedition ever began. And that was very, very important for the cohesiveness of the ship. In assembling the biographies, I also investigated the ships that the men had served on before and after the expedition. I created physical profiles for them, and I even compared them by the counties from which they were born. As you can see, many of the men actually came from the southern counties of England here. Now, this only represents England and Wales. There were people represented from Ireland as well and Scotland. 2 of the men actually stood out in particular because they were men of color. They were of African descent. One of them was born in England. The other claimed to have been born in British North America, or today, as we know, Canada. I looked into him much more closely, and I was able to actually come up with a good bit of circumstantial evidence, very strong circumstantial evidence, that he wasn't Canadian at all. He was a runaway American slave. Or at the very least, his parents were. And again, there was a lot of circumstantial evidence that pointed to this fact. So I was very, very pleased with that, because it's very hard to actually come across that sort of individual and that sort of information. Certainly a lot of men of color served in the Royal Navy for many years throughout the years, but to find that sort of information and connect it to a particular individual at a particular place and time is very difficult. Now, the driving force behind the ship was, of course, the captain, Robert John Le Mesurier McClure. There were portions of his character that can be explained in different ways. And let me get to him. There we go. And what is so important about McClure is the more I looked into his family records, and there were quite a few different family records from different people throughout the years, the more contradictions I ran across. So I really had to work those out. I had to find out what was true and what was not. And some of these things were innocent things. Things that were just mistakes of years, mistakes of locations, and things like that. But it's very difficult with McClure because his father died before he was even born. He died when he was serving in Egypt in the early part of the Napoleonic Wars. So it was very difficult to come across some information, in part because of that, but also because his mother was a wife, a mother, and a widow all within a year. So she had went through a tremendous experience. The baby McClure was actually given up to his godfather to raise. Now, this in of itself was not unusual, but what was really interesting was the fact that McClure was the only child of that household for many, many years before his godparents had children of their own. I think this had a big effect on him because he wasn't the golden child anymore. And his godfather was a former army officer, former general. And when McClure rejected going into an army career and chose a naval career instead, he was behind the curve by several years. So he actually joined the Navy at a much later age in his youth than normal. So again, these things had a cumulative effect on McClure getting ahead, making rank, and progressing in a naval career. I'll read briefly from my book, and it will give you an idea about McClure's naval environment and some of the things that had a direct impact on the expedition. The post-Napoleonic War Navy was spit and polish, and the naval officer prided himself in the keen ship handling through harnessing the wind. McClure was caught in the midst of this transition from sail to steam propulsion that began in fits and starts in the 1820s and 1830s. But the steam engine was an inefficient and unsightly thing. Steam, whose grotesque and clumsy engines, whose monstrous smokestacks there belched forth the smuts, the concentrated mess from the combustion of filthy Newcastle coal, and the first smell and contamination of oil. So steam was seen as an ugly thing, something to be abhorred. And that was the environment that McClure knew. It wasn't just McClure who was infected. There were many, many other people, including one of his commanding officers, who impressed this upon McClure quite heavily. His name was John Ross. The way this played into the story was McClure had a bitter conflict from the very start with his second in command, Lieutenant William H. Haswell, again from my book. While McClure's crewmen were bonding through the renewal of old acquaintances, a grave fracture in his command was taking place, threatening the ship before she ever left England. And the problem started at the top. During the tow down river, Lieutenant Samuel Cresswell's pen painted an ugly scene for his parents. The captain continues to be very civil to me, but poor Haswell catches it on every occasion. Yesterday, the captain went on in a most foolish way with him, saying he should not be in this ship, that he was incompetent to be first lieutenant, and that he would write to I don't know whom. So why did McClure insist on humiliating his first lieutenant, a man whose support would be crucial during the long and difficult voyage ahead? By declaring Haswell should not be in this ship and that he was incompetent. To some degree, the answer was wrapped up in Haswell's previous postings, the Devastation and Penelope steamships. Haswell had served in several sailing ships before this and had been successfully promoted, but he was now well on his way to becoming investigators persona non grata because of the stern warnings John Ross had repeatedly given McClure against ever taking anyone with a background in steam propulsion. So this had a tremendous effect on the structure of the expedition, again, before it ever left England. One of the things that I was very concerned about in my writing was to appeal to the broadest possible audience. And when I say that, I'm talking about anybody from the layperson all the way to the scholar. So bridging that gap, as you were, was going to be something of a challenge. And what it meant was I needed to make the text very readable, and I also needed to set the stage in the first two chapters for what lay ahead. What lay ahead was a tremendous amount of unpublished information that was very detailed. And as time went on, I realized there were certain things that would never be understandable within that framework. So I had to create indexes or indices in order to deal with them. One of these indices, for instance, was the primary sources indices. And this was so important because there was a web of intrigue and unanswered questions among the journals that I had read from the captain, from the assistant surgeon Piers, even from the carpenter Ford. There were a lot of things that weren't adding up, a lot of missing parts, literally missing parts. Let me give you an example. I was able to prove beyond a doubt that McClure kept 2 journals. So this is a multi-part journal, and there was a copy. And what happened is, through time, as far as I know, there's only 1 volume of that journal in existence. The question comes, is that the copy or is that the original? And this sort of thing actually reverberated through the other journals as well, particularly the Surgeon's Journal, Dr. Armstrong. I also created an index of notable sled journeys, and the reason I did this is because when you can attach a particular person to a particular place at a particular time, you can track them, and you can associate those people with specific events or disassociate them with other events. So I created an entire index so you can go back and you can see who was where and when they were participating in various events. These sled journeys actually created stories within themselves because you see certain people appear again and again. In other words, they were favorites among the officers. This isn't unusual because there's a certain connection that you get with someone when you spend days, weeks, months on the sledding trail with the same people. You get to know them. They get to know you. You get to trust them. They trust you. And it also played into the story very much because Haswell, being somebody who was desperately hated by McClure, was kept out of the picture more and more. So he doesn't show up a lot of times in the writings, or he's referred to only slightly, sometimes not even by name. Several years ago, I began work on a 2-part article about this award, the Arctic Medal, 1818-1855. And I had intended to publish it eventually, but as I did the research for the book, it became obvious that this award is actually an integral part of the overall story. Here's why. The reverse of the medal itself, the reverse of the actual award here was designed by Samuel Creswell. And that was no mistake. Creswell had been called to an audience of Queen Victoria and had done paintings during the expedition, and she was very impressed with them. So he had an in right there. The other thing is that Her Majesty Queen Victoria herself, since she was a princess, had a great interest in exploration, particularly polar exploration. And she became convinced that the shape of the medal needed to be octagonal, not round like war medals before and after it. So it stood out. She wanted something that was going to stand out and was going to be different and recognizable. For that information, I'm very grateful to the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle because I was able to get special permission to actually access letters to and from Queen Victoria on this very subject. Now, for all this rich detail and explanations, and believe me, there's a lot more, there's so much that's new in regards to this expedition that I have in my book. I have to tell you, I'm actually going through the book now and making my own notes because I can't even keep up with it all. So I want to have my own notes on some of this and where it actually falls in the book, and that is an ongoing process. But for all this detail and all the richness of the story, it's important to step back and take a look at the big picture. And the big picture is this. There is no one route through the Northwest Passage. It's actually several routes. McClure discovered 2 of them. And through the years, while these guys were out there exploring, the ice conditions made it so that things could change tremendously year to year. In one year, an explorer may have a lot of luck getting through the ice, a lot of ways to go through the ice, and another year, be entirely blocked. So you're really at the mercy of nature. That's very important to remember. The other thing is, no one man can actually claim to have found the Northwest Passage. McClure's experience has really capped 30 years of experiences of many other men who had gone before him, most of them British explorers, in finding a way through the Arctic. And during this time, these men relied very, very heavily on native peoples for guides and assistance. Perhaps most importantly in this regard, McClure's experiences and those of his fellow investigators really can be used as a yardstick in understanding what happened to Sir John Franklin and the men of the missing Erebus and Terror. And it is my earnest wish that my writings will be applied to that very end. Thank you.
So yeah, we could do a question and answer period before we have Ryan Harris come up from Parks Canada. So are there questions for Glenn?
Yes.
And will you repeat the question for the cameras? so
Repeat
we
the
know?
question?
Yeah.
Sure. Yes.
Mr. Stein, enjoyed your book very much.
Thank you.
A question I have about Lieutenant Haswell. What is your judgment of Lieutenant Haswell? Did he merit the condemnation and criticism of his commanding officer?
Well, it was, for what I could find, it was very, very enlightening to show that there was an incident where one of the masts was damaged in a storm, for example, and Haswell was indifferent about inspecting the damage. And McClure was furious about this and literally wrote him up to the Admiralty. And McClure wrote him very hard. So at one point, Haswell supposedly said to him, I've been told by people much your superior that I'm a very good naval officer. So it's hard to understand whether Haswell was saying that because he was being arrogant, or he was saying that because, look, I'm really tired of you riding my back, okay? And I can do my job. And I think when you consider the situation and the confines of a ship, that Haswell had a really, really difficult time staying on even civil grounds with a man who went out of his way to humiliate and hate him. I mean, McClure tried to get the guy off the ship. He tried to kick him off the ship in Hawaii. And he was basically told by other naval officers on the scene, you really don't want to do this. You know, you don't want to kick your first lieutenant off the ship. For one thing, there was nobody to replace him. The other thing, too, is Haswell was actually the flag lieutenant of the commanding officer in his prior command, prior ship. Now, that meant that he was basically a political officer. He was the guy's right arm. And I think very much Haswell had some sort of political connections. That probably irritated McClure. He probably didn't like that because McClure was not someone that had grown up with these or gone through his service with political connections. He got them only very late. So it's a good question as far as, you know, was Haswell really deserving of McClure's condemnation, because it's really a double-edged sword in those circumstances. One of the things, by the way, I would love to find, anybody finds it, I'll give you $1 million, I kid you not, is Haswell's journal. Haswell's journal was actually retrieved from the investigator after it had been abandoned, but I've never been able to track it. And I even went to the lengths of going to the wills of his descendants to try to see if it was passed down in the family. I could never find a trace of it. I get the impression that he never wanted it to be shown. He never wanted it to get out there, certainly never published. So it's possible it was destroyed. But as far as I can tell, it was never passed down in the family. But stranger things have happened, so you never know. Another question? Anybody? Okay, oh, and then next. Thank you.
Oh, right. Oh, wow, that did that without even magic. So our next speaker is Ryan Harris. He's a senior underwater archaeologist with Parks Canada. Ryan received his bachelor's degree in anthropology from the University of Toronto and a master's degree in maritime history and nautical archaeology from East Carolina University. He has been working with Parks Canada since 1999 and has taken part in more than 50 underwater archaeology projects. His archaeology work has helped to locate the wreck of the HMS Investigator, of which he then dove on to conduct a survey of the vessel. Just recently, the Parks Canada underwater archaeology team located one of Franklin's vessels, missing vessels, the HMS Erebus. So today, Ryan is going to share with us some of his work that he's done with the Investigator, and I think some updates of the Erebus work too. I should also note outside at the book display, we have a book called Lost at Sea, Lost in Sea. Lost Beneath the Ice, which is actually documents some of the work that he's done. It's a beautiful, colorful book. So please join me in welcoming Ryan to the Library of Congress.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the warm introduction. More or less, I'm just going to offer some eye candy here to support the launch of Glenn's book, something I've been looking forward to with anticipation myself. And I think that in the fullness of time, I think this book might stand as the authoritative history of HMS Investigator, perhaps for generations, in the same way that Richard Syriax's seminal work on the Franklin expedition remains the authority since its publication in 1939. It was, I think, in 2010 or maybe 2011 where Glenn and I first began to communicate. We had just recently discovered the wreck of HMS Investigator in Canada's high Arctic, and so we had a mutual interest in one another's research. And fairly early on, I was able to come to a sense of, or come to respect Glenn's meticulous research nature, his thoroughness and his humility, and which is quite an attractive trait, which is a pleasure to work with. And yeah, I look forward to getting back to Ottawa and dissecting this work, which will be instrumental in our ongoing research on the wreck site of HMS Investigator. I'll provide a bit of historical background just to facilitate my talk, but it'll include a lot of images of these two rather extraordinary wreck sites, which I hope you'll take interest in. Of course, in broad strokes, the Franklin expedition departed Greenhithe, County Kent in England in May of 1845 with significant fanfare and seemingly justified optimism that finally this sublimely equipped expedition would finally find the elusive Northwest Passage, something that had been the object of English mariners since Elizabethan times and the times of Frobisher and Hudson later on. And so the two ships, Erebus and Terror, with 129 men that ultimately entered the Arctic, including Franklin himself. Obviously things didn't work out so well, and all of these men perished under certainly rather grim circumstances. This, of course, launched, I'll start with the Investigator, but this launched what is often described as the largest rescue operation that's ever been staged in human history. Countless expeditions were launched by the Royal Navy, privately thereafter, American expeditions as well, to try to locate these two missing ships and the missing men. HMS Investigator, amongst its claims to fame, of course, that it was part of the first Royal Navy expedition to look for Franklin and his men. In fact, it was 3 years in that the Admiralty, I think, started to grow apprehensive as to the well-being of the expedition, and James Clark Ross, who actually was offered but declined the command, and probably feeling a certain tinge of guilt perhaps, started to develop a rescue plan, and it's under Ross's recommendation that the Investigator was purchased into the Royal Navy. It was actually building in Greenock, Scotland, we believe as a whaler, and it was converted for Arctic service, and along with HMS Enterprise, made the first search expedition in 1848, heavily modified to withstand Arctic conditions. In fact, the also under the supervision of William Rice, a master shipwright in the Royal Navy. Heavily reinforced with iron plating in the bow, very thick deck beams, and all kinds of internal ironwork. So in 1848, Enterprise, an investigator under the command of James Clark Ross, I think he took it upon himself to try to spearhead the search. They essentially followed in the wake of Franklin, essentially where he was ordered to proceed into Lancaster Sound. And that's where they themselves encountered impenetrable ice, and they were forced to overwinter the northern end of Somerset Island at Port Leopold. But at the time they did send a sledge expedition down Peel Sound, and finding absolutely no concrete trace of the Franklin party having ventured in that direction, that may in fact have sealed the fate of Franklin and his men. Given that it persuaded the Admiralty that Franklin did not proceed in that direction, and it really refocused a lot of their search efforts farther west and north. That said, Franklin was certainly up against a ticking clock, and it ultimately may not have made a difference. So returning to England in 1849, investigator and Enterprise were hastily outfitted again and reprovisioned for a return trip. This time, anticipating, as we said, that Franklin must have made it much farther west, they were sent around South America and through the Straits of Magellan, stopping at the Sandwich Islands, or Hawaii, as Glenn mentioned, where by this time the two ships had been separated in a storm off of South America. And in 1850, McClure led the investigator alone, plunged into the Western Arctic and ultimately into fame and infamy. So he made very steady progress in 1850, following along the North American mainland, again with the explicit orders to try to locate some trace of the Franklin party. So in late 1850, they had identified Prince of Wales Strait, one of the arteries of the Northwest Passage now, and sending a sledge team. By October 26, they had identified that, in fact, this communicated with this open body of water that had been surveyed by Sir William Edward Parry many years before, identifying indeed as a navigable route. Overwintering in the open pack, the following navigation season, investigator proceeded clockwise around Banks Island and encountering treacherous conditions such as this. This is one of Lieutenant Creswell's iconic paintings, and ironically it's almost always used in the context of talking about Franklin, not about investigator itself. And hopefully this book and the discovery of the wreck site will help to properly restore the significance of this work. But as the navigation season drew close to an end, as dusk was descending and with driving snow, the investigators were following along the northern end of Banks Island and inadvertently blundered really into the confines of what is now called Mercy Bay. They stranded on a sandbar and spent much of the next day lightening ship and were able to get it off. And that's where McClure made the often criticized but somewhat logical decision not to press their luck any further and that they would overwinter in Mercy Bay. Ultimately, they spent 2 increasingly harrowing winters with their provisions and rations being reduced and their health failing. And when things were looking rather grim, and McClure had hatched a plan to send half of the ship's company off to try to secure rescue, which is generally admitted, have amounted to a death sentence for all of these men, and would simply have delayed the demise of everyone else left on board the ship, when a solitary figure appeared over the horizon, coming across the strait that now bears McClure's name, and Lieutenant Pym from HMS Resolute, which just happened to be across the strait. And this ultimately is what spared the investigators the same fate that Franklin had by then experienced. Just the serendipitous rescue that came from another Royal Navy ship in the area. So, of course, we had already started on our more recent search for the Franklin, Rex, Erebus, and Terror when we took a parallel interest in HMS Investigator. This shows Banks Island that we had mentioned. And our interest was supported by the fact in Parks Canada that we happen to have a national park that borders Mercy Bay here on all sides. This is Alavik National Park, our second northernmost park in the country, which gave us something of a pretense to go and search for the ship. Given that much of the ship's stores, spars, ship's boats, a significant number of provisions were landed on shore as an emergency depot by the crew and a subsequent party after the ship was abandoned in 1853 after the rescue. Beyond that, we had a certain amount of useful information to go on archaeologically as to where we might find this ship, and this coming to us by the hands of Frederick Krabbe, who was the master of HMS Intrepid in company with the Resolute. And he was sent by the Resolute's captain, Captain Kellett, to conduct a condition assessment of Investigator a year after it had been abandoned. And his sledge team arrived and encountered Investigator looking much like this, with significant amount of water, solid ice actually, in the forward hold, washing over the freshwater holding tanks, down by the head and listening to starboard. And that convinced him that the ship would soon founder. So he and his men in the sledge team took the opportunity to batten the hatches, but only after removing what remained of the ship's stores that weren't firmly frozen in the ice in the hold. And they were added to the depot of stores on the western side of Mercy Bay. So in 2010, our team, the Underwater Archaeology team, working closely with our Western Arctic Field Unit, undertook a fairly ambitious search for this ship in hopes that it might be found close to where it was left at anchor by the crew. That said, there were competing possibilities, different hypotheses as to what may have befell the Investigator after it was abandoned. The Inuvialuit, which is, say, the indigenous people of the Western Arctic, their reports to the Canadian Arctic Expedition in 1915 suggested that, in fact, the ship had either been broken apart on shore or that had drifted out into the open strait and had sank in deep water, which for us would not be very good news. But we went to Mercy Bay anyway. And so in July, this is what the site appeared like after all the ice had cleared from the harbor, from the bay. And in fact, as we flew out for the first time, it was completely stogged with ice, as my Newfoundland wife would say. And so after a year of preparation, we thought that we might not stand any chance to look for it after all. But we spent some time setting up base camp on the western shore, slinging load after load by helicopter from a nearby airstrip, the ominously named Polar Bear Cabin in the northern part of Alavik National Park. And while we readied our marine survey equipment and inflated our Zodiac boats, a terrestrial archaeology team undertook a detailed study of the depot, or the cache site as it's generally known. This is Henry Carey from our Western Arctic Field Unit, an archaeologist, looking at the most prominent feature that survived on shore from the Investigator expedition prior to the discovery of the wreck site, that is. And that's what remains of the 7 tons of coal that was landed on shore, as well as a large scattering of barrel staves, hundreds and hundreds from the provisions that were put there. This is something that really speaks not just to the nautical nature of the cache, but the fact that the Inuvialuit made repeated visits to Mercy Bay to make use of these materials for upwards of 60 years, it is said. And this is actually a frame from one of the Investigator's boats, from one of the ribs, so to speak, of the boat. And we can tell that it's a lapstrake or a clinker-built boat, given the edges of this frame. But every piece you'd find is broken into lengths no longer than say, a foot. And that's so they could harvest and extract every single copper and iron fastener from all these boats to assist their survival, really, which affected their material culture. There are many interesting historical, archaeological, and anthropological parallels that can be drawn between Investigator and Franklin's ships, and this is one of them in a small way. Right on top of the cache site, face down, was this bit of boat timber. This is actually the stem or the bow timber from one of the boats. And as you turn it over, you can actually see that it's engraved There's a W that stands for the Woolwich Dockyard, where the ship outfitted in 1850. A Royal Navy broad arrow mark. This is a government property mark, which you'll see repeatedly in this presentation, as well as the length of this particular boat, likely 22 feet. This immediately reminded us of a find made by the McClintock expedition in 1859. All kinds of McClintock expedition maps and books on display here today. And by his subordinate, Lieutenant Hobson on King William Island, found the remains of one of the ship's boats from Erebus or Terror, with 3 skeletons inside. And ultimately, the boat's stem was recovered by the Schwatka expedition in 1879 and now is visible at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, London. Here we see, again, the W for Woolwich, the date, April of 1845, the length of the boat. And this was actually built by contract, so it didn't have a broad arrow mark. So this is a Carville-built boat, which was often provided to the Navy. A clinker-built boat that was provided to the Navy under contract, because the dockyards weren't doing this anymore. Also, the analysis of the cache included a systematic magnetometer or walking gradiometer survey, which identified all the magnetic anomalies from the cache, hoops from the casks, small nails, whatever the Nuvialuit didn't detect. But also these 3 anomalies here. And Ed Easta of University of Western Ontario suspected these might in fact represent the graves of the 3 investigator crewmen who were not rescued. We know their names: John Boyle, John Ames, and John Kerr, who also succumbed to scurvy just before the Resolute rescued them. And actually, John Moore, my colleague in the unit, oddly enough, he was eating a lot more oranges, not wanting to suffer the curse of Johns in Mercy Bay. And ultimately, if you go exact to that point on the magnetometer map, well, you see them, these outlines of 3 graves where the permafrost is not slumped because it's held up by a coffin. These are coffin-shaped outlines, which makes us think of the 3 Beechy Island graves that were from the HMS Erebus and the Terror. So as the terrestrial team did their work, we took to our 19-foot Zodiac and conducted a towed side-scan sonar survey to try to locate the wreck site. And in contrast to what you'll see with the search for Erebus later in this presentation, this actually went very, very quickly. After a year of preparation and the effort of getting all this equipment to the Arctic, ultimately it took us 3 minutes to locate this wreck site. I wish it was always that easy, and it certainly is not. But this is one of the earlier images showing the investigator wreck site, this being the stern and the bow. We could tell right away that it was in remarkably sound condition, still preserved to the height of the weather deck, the upper deck, although impacted by the ice, and you see ice scouring all about the perimeter of the site. And this is a little sketch by John showing the ice conditions. We weren't really even intending to survey that day, we were just testing the equipment, because the bay was still solidly full of ice. We just had this small serpentine route that we could follow to test the equipment, and that just happened to be exactly where the wreck was located, and generally very close to where Frederick Krabbe pinpointed it for us, kindly enough, in 1854. So it was another year before we could return to the wreck site of the investigators to dive it, a very long year for us in the unit, waiting with anticipation. And just an extraordinary experience of diving a pristine shipwreck site this far north at 74 degrees northern latitude. And only when you see it up close can you really appreciate just the magnitude of it, but really just how well preserved it is. This is a close-up looking at the stern, and the entire hull of the ship is clad with copper because the ship went around South America through the tropics, stopping at Hawaii. It was clad in copper to deter ship boring, Teredo nivalis, shipworm and gribbles and that sort of thing, which would eat the wood. And we can still see the copper draft marks, which here shows that we're 12 feet above the keel, and the gudgeons upon which the rudder would have, the hinges essentially that the rudder would have swung on. So we had a very productive time. We made over 100 dives on the site, or 9 intense days of diving, often diving till 4 o'clock in the morning, because at this time of the summer we enjoy perpetual daylight. And here we're inserting a high-definition point-of-view inspection camera into the nooks and crannies below the decks, trying to identify what spaces would preserve their archaeological integrity. Ultimately, what we found is that the entire ship was silted in, which was disappointing in a way, but actually bodes very, very well for the preservation of materials down in the lower deck. And here we see the 20-odd cabins for the ship's officers, including the great cabin for McClure in the stern, but Haswell and Creswell and Armstrong and everyone else. And we think that many of these spaces will actually survive intact, representing small time capsules representing the shipboard life of those specific individuals, which is very exciting for us as archaeologists. And then deeper down in the bowels of the ship, beyond what we can glimpse, certainly there's just enormous potential. The botanical and biological samples that are preserved, probably with their labels even intact, down in the bread room, whatever would perhaps remain in the spirit locker down below. But other structures like Mr. Sylvester's patent heating apparatus, a coal-fired heater for warming the ship in Arctic conditions. And we had enough time to have a good look and to recover a certain number of representative and diagnostic artifacts. I'm not sure you can see in this light, but the entire site is covered by a thin lens of silt. And here you see the outline of a boot, which upon recovery you can see is a typical square-toed Arctic Sea Service boot. Very, very much like finds that have been attributed to the Erebus and the Terror. This Arctic boot from Starvation Cove, where the final survivors at that time succumbed, we believe. And really demonstrating just the very close parallels in material culture that we stand to identify between the two shipwreck sites. Probably the most evocative artifact that was recovered from Investigator in 2011, and you can just see it as it was lying in situ. There's the trigger, and over here the butt plate for this very well preserved 1839 pattern percussion sidelock musket, which we carefully wrapped up and were able to recover to the surface. And now it's in conservation treatment at our labs in Ottawa. And again, we can find close parallels to this sort of firearm in the relic collection at the National Maritime Museum from all of these implements from the Erebus and Terror that were recovered by the Inuit and ultimately purchased by various search parties in the mid-19th century. In fact, the brass tang plate on this particular firearm is so well preserved it preserves a lot number or perhaps even a serial number, the date likely of assembly in 1842, and a WXD, which during this period of time actually stands for the Woolwich Division of the Royal Marines. So we can actually attribute this particular firearm to the handful of Royal Marines that were garrisoned to Investigator for this second Arctic voyage. So in broad strokes, of course, we can see the progress of the investigators where they overwintered, ultimately where the ship was abandoned in 1853, and they made their way across the Northwest Passage, ultimately largely on foot, as the Resolute and the Intrepid were ordered to be abandoned when they got trapped in the ice by Commodore Belcher off of Cape Coburn. But eventually, they all piled onto a small number of transport vessels, including the HMS North Star, and made their way back home again. So, discovering the Northwest Passage, but also affecting the first European, let's say, transit, although largely on foot, and in the process, really the first circumnavigation of all of North and South America at the same time. Here, of course, is the reconstructed route taken by the Franklin Party, just to change gears, which obviously ends in a dead end here off of King William Island, where the two ships Erebus and Terror were last seen by whalers in Baffin Bay, where they first overwintered in 1845 to 1846 off Beechy Island, where those three graves from that party are located. And the following navigation season, 1846, we believe they descended Peel Sound, were beset in ice or trapped in ice, the grip of which would not release these two ships for the following 2 years. So we know from this rather iconic cairn note that's now on display at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, which tells us, until the discovery really of the Erebus wreck site, really most of what we know, at least from European sources. So in this note, it's kind of a terse form letter that announced that things were going reasonably well. In 1847, where they overwintered, it was signed by Lieutenant Graham Gore of the Erebus. But they returned to this note a year later and left a far more chilling account in the marginalia. This signed now by Captain Crozier of HMS Terror, who now had assumed the command of the overall expedition. It announces in typically terse Royal Navy style that Franklin had died the previous year, and they don't bother to say why or how. And announced their intention to desert the two ships 5 leagues northwest of this point, giving us a sort of a last reported position of where these ships were last seen by their European crews, supposedly. And that's really where the historical record ends when it comes to Erebus and Terror. So what we had to rely on archaeologically in the search was a corpus of Inuit testimony from the mid-19th century that was recorded by a succession of search parties, including McClintock, who we mentioned, in 1859. 10 years later, Charles Francis Hall, the American publisher, who felt he was on a mission from God to save these men. 10 years years after McClintock, and certainly 20 years too late. And Frederick Schwatka, a U.S. Army cavalry officer, who was in the area around 1879, who probably maintained no hope of actually finding survivors, but the hope that they might find some telling written record. So all of this evidence is kind of conveniently captured in this UK Admiralty chart 5101, which in red shows observations of skeletal remains, the sun-bleached bones of the Franklin crew as they now are strewn across the landscape. But in blue, and this is all color-coded and mentioned in the legend, which I've cropped off here for display purposes, but the blue is the Inuit accounts, and actually specifically says in the legend that they're not inherently trustworthy given the source. Ironically, with the benefit of hindsight, we now see that, in fact, it was Inuit testimony that was instrumental in our ability to locate the wreck of HMS Erebus just last September in 2014. But this shows 2 possible trajectories for one of the ships that end up in the southern Queen Maud Gulf area. The Inuit suggest that the fate of the 2 ships after they were abandoned somehow parted ways. That one of the ships somehow made it farther south, the other ship sunk earlier on in deeper water, they claim, and that they weren't able to harvest any materials from it. So we've been looking for in both areas since 2008, and by 2014 we had amassed over 1,400 square kilometers of side-scan sonar coverage, an area significantly larger even than the area of Los Angeles. Substantial area. Typically using this tool as the mainstay of our toolbox in searching for shipwreck targets. This is a towed side-scan sonar system, which produces acoustic 2-dimensional images of the seafloor, identifying superimposed objects, including hopefully shipwrecks. So over the course of 6 years, towing the side-scan sonar system all over the place and staring at the monotonous flow of the data down the sonar screen, something called a waterfall, we had not encountered a single solitary trace of anything cultural, not a log, nothing. It is a very barren landscape, at least to our eyes. And there was just nothing, no promising leads. Finally, in 2014, we actually caught a break. And actually our terrestrial archaeology counterparts, been working with us side by side since 2008, came across this object during their effort to set up a GPS reference station with our hydrographic service on a nearby island. And the helicopter pilot, Andrew Sterling, came across this object, which was brought back to the ship, and pretty quickly we were actually able to identify what specifically it represented. And I don't think you can see in this lighting, but there are 2 broad arrow marks, so these ubiquitous government property marks that clearly told us this object came from one of Franklin's ships. There are only so many Royal Navy ships sunk in the area, after all. And in consultation with the ship's plans of Erebus and Terror, in fact, it was only a couple hours before Johnny was able to decipher what exactly this was. And that it was a lower pintle, the anchor point for one of the ship's davits for deploying and recovering the ship's boats over the the stern quarters of the ship. So this also told us that a large, heavy iron object likely indicated that a wreck was close at hand. Something that the Inuit likely who had cached that behind a large boulder would not want to carry with them all across the Arctic, being rather heavy and not terribly useful. So it appears that they broke off the pintle end and probably fashioned that into something useful, and then dumped it where it was found. So excitedly, the next day we took to the water again and shifted our survey area a little bit to the east. And with our survey vessel, the aptly named Research Vessel Investigator, where HMS Investigator was unsuccessful in locating any sign of the ship's investigator. The second got lucky on September 2nd, 2014. And under absolutely sublime survey conditions, at long last, we found the first images, and it was absolutely unmistakable when it first appeared on the screen. This is actually a few passes later after we approached it differently, but just the cathartic relief really that after 6 years of searching with growing comments from the media that why were we wasting our time, suggestions that even if we found something it would be nothing but toothpicks on the bottom, why were you bothering? Finally, this remarkably intact Royal Navy shipwreck appeared on our screen. At this time, we didn't know which ship it was. That would take quite a bit of research as subsequent investigation. But from the initial sonar images, we were able to tell that it was intact again to the height of the weather deck, that it was standing, given the acoustic shadow, a full 4.5 or 5 meters proud of the seafloor. And we could actually see telltale signs of the Royal Navy modification for Arctic service. So we were absolutely convinced it was the ship we were looking for, as if there's much doubt. So excitedly, after the announcement was made by our Prime Minister in Ottawa, we were all sent back to the site, our entire dive team deployed, and excitedly made the first dives on the wreck of what we now know to be the Erebus. What I would certainly describe as the most remarkable sensation of my professional career, there's no doubt about that. As everywhere your eyes would dart, there's something remarkable just lying there, tucked in amongst the collapsed timbers. And one of the first things you could see are these two beautiful brass 6-pounder cannon just lying on seafloor right astern of the wreck. And this is something I find interesting as someone who's interested in steam propulsion in the Royal Navy in the mid-19th century. This is the outer stern post and the inner stern post, to get excessively technical, but you'll see these cast bronze railings, and these are tracks that actually allowed the ship's two-bladed propeller to be lowered into position and then retracted again. The Erebus and the Terror were the first ships to be outfitted with a steam-driven screw propeller for the purposes of polar navigation. And so we're very interested in studying this, as at this time marine steam power was still very much in its infancy. And here you can actually see the tracks in the little slot. This is where the propeller shaft would have rotated. And we have, of course, the reference from the ship's plans in the National Maritime Museum. And this shows this rather crude-looking two-bladed propeller. They didn't even have the terminology set yet. They called it the fan blades of the screw. And this does detail both the tracks, but the mechanism that they would, when retracted, they would lower these chocks, wooden, and actually this is a tank, to stop up the space, because they wouldn't want the ice to get a purchase on where the propeller was and rip the stern off. And we actually have reference to this interesting sketch by Lieutenant Irving from the expedition, actually, during their dispatches sent home from Greenland. And in a letter to his sister, Katie, he shows a sketch, and this is one of the steam engines. And worth mentioning, of course, these were not purpose-built marine steam engines. They were adapted locomotive engines from the Greenwich Railway. basically dropped into the aft hold, turned sideways, and with the wheels removed to drive a propeller shaft. So really, really interesting. Something that interests about both ships, again, is that they represent these rather unique repositories of a very obscure Victorian industrial technology. These are the ship's main bilge pumps. These are patented Massey double action lift and force bilge pumps. Something you can't find anywhere else in the world. You can't go to the Science Museum and see what these look like and how they operate. So really, we only have recourse to underwater archaeology here. There's a close-up of these are the pump heads. They'd be turned with a big bell crank to siphon the water out of the ship's hold. They wanted to outfit these ships with the most capable technology available, given the difficulty of the task that was handed to them. So this is a plan of the upper deck of the Erebus, showing the bilge pumps there. There. And these illuminators are deck prisms that would filter ambient light below decks to make the place a bit more hospitable during the long winter months. And this is actually kind of hard to see, I gotta say, but here I'm actually looking through a deck combing. So right on top of the upper deck, this is a skylight that would have been situated directly over top of the wardroom. So I can imagine the sailors casually walking by here and eavesdropping on conversations just below here between the senior officers, where probably a lot of significant decisions were mulled over. And this is the something we don't commonly see on shipwrecks, certainly in Canada. This is the ship's tiller, but it's actually solid bronze. It usually be something made out of wood. And there's the end of it. It's 12 feet long, and this is where we would notch into the rudder. And essentially, this is a big beam that allowed the rudder to articulate. It's bronze, we think, because the ship's hull was lengthened to accommodate the propeller. So now, all of a sudden, the rudder's now several feet farther aft. So they need a really strong rudder. This is maneuvered by the ship's helm, or the wheel. So they, like many features of these ships, they're heavily, heavily overbuilt to withstand Arctic conditions. But certainly one of the most iconic artifacts that we encountered right away on actually the very first dive. This is the ship's bell. The only artifact we recovered in the first series of dives in September. And again, it's emblazoned or embossed actually with the Royal Navy broad arrow. And very conveniently, the date, 1845. Archaeology should always be that straightforward. So quickly, we wanted to get back to the site. We only had 2 days to reconnoiter the site before the season ended in September. So we went back with our Department of National Defense in April. As you can see, it's solid ice at this point in time. And the Department of National Defense set up an ice camp for about 50 people right over top of the wreck site. And by boring these large holes, we were able to dive through the ice and access the wreck under very, very stable conditions. One of these blocks would take about 5 hours to painstakingly melt with a special tool, and then to lift clear of the surface. And so working closely with our fleet diving units of Halifax and also our Pacific region, we conducted 80 dives over the course of 5 days and got to know the wreck site a little bit better. I should mention this is called Operation Nunalvet. It was supported by the United States in one respect, that the camp was demobilized by 2 ski-equipped C-130 Hercules from the New York Air National Guard. And so these poor guys built a runway on the ice for weeks, just plowing snow for weeks on end. And finally, they're able to land these gigantic Hercules planes to load all the camp in, which made things much easier at the end. So after the April dives, we started preparing again for return to the site this last August and September, a year after the wreck discovery, and enjoying some of the best weather conditions we've ever seen working in the Arctic. Our team made in excess of 150 dives, clearing the overgrowth of kelp, which concealed a lot of the ship's structures. And here you can see just the remarkable water clarity that they were enjoying at the time. This is like diving the Caribbean in terms of how far you can see. So this is a view of the port side of the Erebus with the exposed upper deck beams where the deck planking has peeled away. And looking up at the bow, and you can get a sense of how close it is to the surface, the wreck being only 11 meters deep, but the top being 6 meters below the surface. And along the port side, again, after all the kelp has been removed, you really get a sense of how well preserved the ship is. The ice channels on either side of the hull, typical of Royal Navy ships of Arctic exploration. And subtle details we can finally see with the kelp removed, including the draft marks. Here you see the copper cutout Roman numerals showing 20 feet at this height above the keel. And what's neat is that they're half obscured by this iron plating. Like Investigator, Erebus and Terror were both fitted with a 5/16 layer of plating at the bow to help protect the bows from ice damage. But it's really the artifacts that tell an evocative story. Only after they were cleaned in the lab could you make much out of these two buttons recovered from the lower deck, from actually inside the ship. And it is hard to see unless you're holding it in your hand, but both show a fouled anchor with a crown over top of it, symbol of the Royal Navy, and the lettering, which took us a while to make out, Royal Marines. So both these buttons would apparently derive from one of the jackets or tunics from one of the, could be any from either ship, so one of the 13 Royal Marines that entered the Arctic. And also really delicate artifacts which tell us something about life on board the ship. We've only scratched the surface, but this is a patent medicine bottle. It's embossed with the name Samuel Oxley, and the other side, London. And Mr. Oxley was a royal chemist who at this time had patented a concentrated essence of Jamaican ginger, which apparently could cure just about anything, including arthritis and seasickness, which makes sense given the ginger. But also as a cure for hypochondria, ironically enough. And then artifacts just lying in plain view. You can see some fine earthenware ceramic plates. Over here is either a pewter or even perhaps a silver plate serving platter. And this is the circular deck illuminator, one of which has fallen down into the ship. After cleaning, some of the ceramics is really quite vivid. Actually, it preserves the stamps on the back and even the type, which is a wampum pattern, which a lot of officers serving in the Orient would return back to England with their own personal collections. And this make reference to when the ship was last seen, really before we stumbled upon it in 2014. And the Inuits specifically mentioned going on board this ship, that they saw 4 sets of footsteps trailing off to Adelaide Peninsula nearby, perhaps the final survivors. That finally, after the ship was deserted, we think, it would seem for a second time, ostensibly being remanned, that they went on board and found everything in complete order. The china plates that we see there, spoons and knives and forks, likely which, if they saw them, they probably would have taken them, being quite useful to modify into tools. And this rather interesting artifact, this is a turned wooden table leg. It's mahogany with an attached stretcher and clearly a table. But we suspect it might in fact be this table. This is an illustration from the Illustrated London News of 1845 during the month of departure, and actually purports to show Franklin's own cabin and this table here. And actually the sonar imagery shows that a big bite of the stern, the great cabin, was bitten away by the ice, and a lot of these materials now have been deposited straight to the seafloor. So it's quite possibly what we see right there. So this is the area in the lower deck where we are encountering a lot of these plates and other scientific instruments and some other things I'll show you. But this is the area where the common sailors would sling their hammocks and take their meals. In fact, if you look up at the upper deck beams overhead, you can see the hammock tags with numbers on them, showing where your particular allotted space is. Just incredible detail. Again, on the lower deck inside the ship, this is a large chest. Apparently some of the contents preserved inside. This, we believe, would have doubled as the seats that they use for at the mess tables, as the ship's plans show. And just very delicate things. You can see it here. This is a sword hilt, or the handle of a naval cutlass, which still preserves all these subtle details, the shark skin grip, the lion head at the pommel end, and even the gold wire braid that kind of holds the grip together. Very, very ornate and really interesting to us archaeologically, but quite possibly of no interest whatsoever to the Inuit, who quite possibly snapped off the steel blade and discarded this piece of useless junk, as they would see it. So as we go ahead with the archaeological study of the wreck of the Erebus, we now enter into a very interesting stage where this is showing how we've divided the area into provenience areas in order to contextualize where artifacts come from, to help us identify associations with other finds, to learn more about the ship. And it's where we'll be in a position to answer some of these more interesting archaeological questions. We believe that the ship was likely remanned, as the Inuit suggest. We hope to be able to identify in short order how it sank. We note that there's a shoal nearby with some materials lost or deposited nearby, which possibly means that they may have escaped the clutches of the ice only to run aground and have the ship sink. Perhaps they didn't have enough manpower at this point to adequately man the ship's pumps or to lighten the ship to get it off. Hopefully we'll find out. In the case of the investigator, where you can start seeing the tensions simmering as men were on short rations and the officers are starting to second guess perhaps the command decisions, or at least privately. Did the discipline of the Franklin expedition break down? If the men came back to the ship, was it because the party had fractured, or was it all survivors at that point to return to the ship? We don't know. Anthropologically, is there evidence of the Inuit going on board and harvesting useful raw materials, sifting through the materials on the lower deck, collecting the knives and discarding the ship's portraits and paintings and that sort of thing? We hope to be able to test some of the prevailing hypotheses about what happened with the Franklin expedition. The Inuit report seeing unopened tins of meat. Maybe we'll find them, maybe we'll be able to test the quality. The theory of lead poisoning being a long-standing contributing factor as has been hypothesized. So we'll be able to test some of these views. Ultimately, archaeologically, we want to figure out what happened in the final stages of the Franklin expedition and what really caused the expedition to fail. Although I think that's really a spurious question, because I think the Franklin expedition failed on May 5th, 1845, when they received their orders from the Admiralty. And really that's when they were directed into one of the worst ice choke points in the Canadian Arctic, a place situated along the west coast of King William Island where the Inuit would almost never travel because there's nothing to subsist on. What we can tell from the care note left on King William Island, recovered by the McClintock party, is that Franklin apparently followed his orders to the letter. He was proceeding after trying to identify a North Polar Sea, which doesn't exist, but proceeding southwest to the surveyed part of the North American mainland. I'm not sure that Franklin and his men really ever stood a chance, no matter what they would have done. Which I suppose brings us to this interesting question of the discovery of the Northwest Passage, which Glenn was speaking to. And I can't help but think of the Franklin Monument that is placed in Waterloo Place in London, where really at the insistence of his wife or widow, Lady Jane Franklin, the credit was given to Franklin and his men for forging the last link of the Northwest Passage with their lives. This years after the investigator and the crew had been awarded the 10,000-pound Admiralty prize for accomplishing that feat. Of course, they lived to tell the tale, and that really is the fundamental difference. Significantly, however, finding Erebus where it lies And given the possibility that we might be able to test archaeologically that it had been remanned, there's every possibility that the men on board that ship knew exactly where they were, and in fact knew that they had affected that last link and had linked up with the shoreline surveyed by Simpson and Dees in 1839. It was probably small consolation for the fate that would shortly befall them, however. I'll leave it at that, and in hopes that we might have some interesting questions and discussion with whatever time remains. And I thank you very much for your interest. Cheers.
If you can repeat the question.
Yes.
Do we have any questions for Ryan? Sir?
As far as Canada sticking now with analysis of the Erebus site, or is the search for the terror continuing as much as before?
Yes, the question is whether we're going to concentrate our efforts on studying the wreck site of HMS Erebus or also continue and searching for the second ship, the Terror. And yes, last summer we did both concurrently, which is quite a challenge. And we have instructions to continue to try to locate the second wreck as well. And ultimately, we look at it as together these ships are a designated National Historic Site in Canada. And really together, we need to have both to flesh out all the details of what happened to the Franklin party. Also, for us to protect and preserve that second wreck site for posterity, for the benefit of Canadians and people who are interested worldwide, we have to identify the wreck site and figure out what sort of condition it's in. So yes, we will be continuing that effort for the foreseeable future.
Two things on the demise that came to my attention. Could Franklin have backed out when he hit that ice that you and I were discussing? I had an impression that he had a shot at getting out if he wanted to and didn't. And the second thing, the food poisoning, hadn't it already set in to the extent that without some alternate source of food they would die anyway?
Yes, very good questions. I wish I could say demise with that sort of dramatic emphasis that you're capable of. That's great. You had asked when the ships became beset in Larsen Sound, so north of King William Island in 1846. Was that avoidable? Ultimately, was that an error in judgment? Well, we don't necessarily know. I mean, that's sort of difficult to reconstruct those moments. But what we certainly can say, having surveyed in those waters for several years now, that the ice conditions can change very, very quickly, particularly late in the season, come late September. There's an almost inexhaustible supply of ice constantly coming down McClintock Channel to the northwest. And that if the wind had been blowing easterly and then all of a sudden swung to the northwest, very quickly there would be a wall of ice right on top of them. You can also experience flash freezes where a change in wind direction will bring remarkably colder temperatures, and you can have dramatic freezing right away. A lot of this information comes to us from a historical ice climatology study that was conducted for us by Tom Zagon of our Canadian Ice Service, trying to reconstruct the prevailing patterns of ice formation, drift, and breakup in Victoria Strait to help us try to narrow our search, because otherwise we're left with a considerable area. It's tough to say if they would have had anywhere else to go. They couldn't necessarily have just doubled back and gone up Peel Sound again. We don't know, but it's almost amazing they got down Peel Sound in the first place. In the same way that unusual ice conditions allowed investigators to enter Mercy Bay in late September, which we never see today. Somehow Peel Sound happened to be navigable for Franklin and his men when it hadn't been for any other expedition prior. So really the ice, it sort of set the trap. I think you might use this reference in your book, but and they kind of blundered into it in both cases and then couldn't get out. It was like a snare. Also, they didn't know at that time, unless they explored it, that there was water to the east of King William Island, was now James Clark Ross Strait. This was still perceived to be a peninsula attaching to Boothia. So yeah, it's a difficult question, but it's tough. I don't think we can second guess what happened to them. I'm sure they were making every effort to avoid being beset in the ice if they could possibly help it, but I doubt it was avoidable. And the second part of your question, food poisoning. Which, of course, relates to the work of forensic anthropologist Owen Beattie from the University of Alberta, who disinterred the 3 graves on Beechey Island, was able to collect tissue samples from hair and what have you, and was able to identify a significantly elevated concentration of lead in those tissues. And that led him to hypothesize that lead poisoning not necessarily would have been the fatal undoing of the expedition, but it may have been a significant mitigating factor that would have clouded their judgment and made made it even more miserable than it already was. The theory of lead poisoning has been subject to a lot of scrutiny in recent years, and there might be a prevailing view that we really need to revisit that hypothesis. I think that the research needs to be done to identify whether their level of lead poisoning was in any way unusual for people from Victorian England, where lead was ubiquitous, used in pencils and paint and tobacco tins and lead crystal, lead pipes. It was used everywhere, and they didn't know the pernicious effects at the time. So were these levels any different from anyone else at the time? It's tough to say. But if it was a problem, then it would have been exacerbated over time. Would have theoretically have worsened, but no doubt there were other things that would have been at play. And scurvy being the typical ailment that befalls most Arctic expeditions that happen to linger past 3 years. And 3 years really seems to be this kind of a pivotal moment where, in Mercy Bay in 1853, under shortened rations, where your body's weaker and weaker, you hear a concept called Arctic scurvy, I think, that Andrew Lambert talks about. Where you're even more subject to the debilitating effects of scurvy when you're on shortened rations and your body's cold and you just never get a chance to recover fully. So yeah, I think there's a lot of research to do to figure out really what happened. In the back.
I'm curious about your Inuit sources and what form those take and what sort of record that is that you're describing.
Yeah, with a bit more time to drone on, I would have gone into some of those details. Really the search parties in the mid-19th century, so John Ray, McClintock, Hall, Schwacke, they all interviewed Inuit informants, often with the question, do you know anything about these Kablunak, these white men that appeared however many years ago? Do you know where they went? Do you know where these ships are? And in some cases, those accounts are amazingly detailed. I mentioned Mr. Paturak, who gives clear indications that, as they saw it, the ship had been remanned in the Queen Maud Gulf, that there were fresh sweepings from under the ship's doors, that it was still being maintained. Ultimately, that they found a corpse on board, that a heavy-set individual that had difficulty removing, so they just left him on the cabin floor. An individual we may have come across archaeologically and be able to figure out who it was through DNA sampling. There's certainly that possibility. But of fairly substantial corpus of Inuit observations that have been picked over through the years. Certainly David Woodman, the author from Victoria, British Columbia, has probably done the most to try to weave all this information into a coherent narrative. As he will point out, the challenge for historians and archaeologists in trying to interpret the Inuit testimony is that it's been filtered through several different lenses by that time. And then when we have recorded references to a shipwreck being gesunken in Schwacke's and his party's account, 8 miles west of Grant Point. Well, the Inuits would not have said west. They wouldn't have said Grant Point. They wouldn't have said east either, or west rather. that they have a completely different worldview that makes these observations difficult to decipher. When they talk about days travel, well, a day of travel in terms of gauging distance is a very different thing for a Royal Navy sledge party as it is with a lightly laden and experienced group of Inuit habituated to Arctic travel for their entire lives.
Okay, thank you. Oh, yeah, we could do, I was gonna say one more, because I know we have to do the book signing and we have a lunch reservation at 1:30.
Okay, really quickly, down at the National Archives, we're working on a digitization project where we are digitizing all our U.S. Navy and Coast Guard vessel logbooks that visited the Arctic region and posting them online. And in this era of digitization, I was hoping you could comment on how these kinds of projects, and I know there are many that are going on here at the library as well, how those projects impact you as underwater archaeologist, and perhaps Mr. Stein can comment on being a historian.
Yes, I can certainly say that I wish that the Smithsonian had digitized the manuscripts of Charles Francis Hall, because it would have saved us the effort of coming down and copying them in facsimile. Yes, these are incredible repositories. Research afoot to really pour into the logbooks of all these expeditions to try to recreate climatological patterns of the mid-19th century. It's really an untapped resource, and definitely those sort of journals will contribute to that.
I'm sorry, repeat again what you're specifically asking.
So as an historian, how more
I knew you'd fallen asleep.
more and more resources are available online and through these digitization projects here at the library and elsewhere. I was just wondering how that, as a historian, how is that changing the way you conduct research? Or
It changed it slightly in that I used throughout the time I was writing the book, I used the internet as a pointer toward where artifacts and certainly repository for archives were stored. But the problem is this, is that you wouldn't get the whole picture unless you were on site. And I went, and unfortunately, you can't always trust some of the things that are actually set in the records as to what the objects are. For instance, one journal that was described in the archives was not a journal at all. It was a book manuscript, a draft of a manuscript written in the form of a journal. So it was totally misleading until I got on site and I looked at the actual item. I said, well, this is not a journal. This is written like a journal, which means, okay, it's been edited. So it's very helpful to have these things on site or online, pardon me, but there's nothing like being there, let's put it that way. There's nothing like being there. You really have to take it all in. And you would not believe how much I found where I did not expect to find it, because again, there were errors in cataloging, or things were not cataloged necessarily as well. And I found other correspondence in certain folders, which sometimes was very helpful, and other times had nothing whatever to do with what I was looking at. So I think you have to be very careful about that. I think you have to really be there. I went twice to England and spent a lot of time looking at everything I could, having my hands on it. And by the way, just to finish off, there's nothing like comparing handwriting, because I found, and this is what I did in my book, I found it very important to put that an item was a copy of a letter or a copy of something. And you've noticed that the handwriting was not the same. So yes, it was a copy, not in that same person's hand. It becomes very subtle. A lot of subtleties involved here, which I hope translated well into my writings. Oh, and by the way, I want to mention that I misspoke when I was talking about McClure's anti-steam former commander. It was James Clark Ross, not his uncle John Ross, who was anti-steam and impressed that so much on McClure.
Right, thank you. So, book signing?
Yeah.
Can I sneak in one more question? What's left to be done with the investigator? Parks Canada, what has to be done still?
Yeah, I mean, of the 200 hours that we have on the wreck of the Erebus, we have much less time on the wreck of Investigator. In fact, if we'd had our druthers, we probably would have been happily diving on the Investigator to this day. But encouraged to continue the search for Erebus and Terror. It became certainly a source of great interest for our cabinet. So we're eager to go back to the investigator site, but really we're just scratching the surface. In many ways, what we might stand to learn from the Erebus wrecks archaeologically might be more influential in reconstructing the history of what happened, as the fate of the investigators is pretty well documented. I'm sure what Glenn would hope for is that at some point we'll come across some preserved paper materials, which is not impossible at all, with all that silt and the cold water temperatures and the darkness, being covered by ice for 85% of the year or longer. There's definitely the prospect of those sort of materials surviving. Is there a journal cached in one of the cabins somewhere that never made it off the ship? You never know. Yeah.
Thank you.
Cheers, thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.